Hey, so today I'm going to be going over this free response question. It's from last year. We're going to look at this first question, right? It has 5 parts, and it really incorporates all of Unit 5 into one long free response question. And it starts off by saying Canada is in an open economy that is currently in a recessionary output gap. And it wants us to draw a correctly labeled graph of long-run aggregate supply, short-run supply, aggregate demand, and to, of course, label the current equilibrium and full employment output. So go ahead and grab a pen with black or dark blue ink, and let's graph along. Let's see if we can do this without looking at any notes. Let's go to the draw pad, and let's represent Canada. So we got the Canadian economy. And remember that we have our price level and our real GDP. It wants us to label our short run. It wants us to label aggregate demand, and it wants us to label that current equilibrium as price level 1 and Y1. And it said that we're in a recessionary gap, right? So we need to draw our long run somewhere, and it's of course where we get to draw this to the left and in the middle or to the right. And what a recessionary gap is that our output right here, our YF, is less. It's going to be less than our full employment output. Look at these clash of colors. So there's our, I think that's all of question 1, right? We have everything. It says the current equilibrium, Y1 and PL1, full employment output labeled as YF. And boom, that's the first 2 parts of the first question. Let's see what else it's saying. It's saying part B, it says the central bank and the government do not take any policy actions to close this output gap. Explain how the economy will adjust to full employment in the long run. And on our graph, show how the economy could adjust. Okay, so if you remember, there's 3 main ways that we can close this output gap. We can enact some fiscal policy, maybe the Federal Reserve can enact some monetary policy, or we can simply do nothing and wait for the market to correct itself. And it's asking us, why would the market correct itself? And there's a couple of reasons within this graph that could lead to a chain of events that could change this short-run aggregate supply. And it's all based around prices, right? Prices and wages. Usually in a recession, if we have that recessionary gap, what this is going to do is going to lead to a decrease in prices. And it's going to lead to a decrease of wages. Things are getting cheaper, people are getting paid less. And if you remember our determinants, what can shift and affect and influence the aggregate supply? Well, it's prices and wages, right? If things get cheaper or easier to produce, then we will have an increase in the short-run aggregate supply. And you can think of wages and workers, those are inputs, right? Those are input prices, meaning that if a company has to pay their workers less, it is therefore cheaper for that company to produce their goods. So both of these things will eventually lead to an increase in the short-run aggregate supply. And how is that going to look on the graph? Well, if we have an increase in the short run aggregate supply. This is I'm operating under the perfect best case scenario here. It's going to increase, and that perfect best case scenario, we're going to stop right there to that full employment equilibrium. PL2. I wonder if it says anything about labeling. On your graph in part A, show how the economy adjusts to full employment in the long run, and we got to explain. So here's our explanation. Ideally, we should write that out in a sentence, right? So we can just say increase. Oh no, decrease in wages. And wages will ultimately lead to an increase in the short run supply. So there's our explanation, and then we showed it here on the graph. Bam. So there's part 1 and part 2 of this first question about the Canadian economy. Let's look what part 3 has to offer, or part C. So suppose the Canadian government is unwilling to wait for the long run adjustment process, right? Which is usually the case. Governments aren't going to want to wait for the long run, wait for the market to fix itself, right? Because we don't know how long run could really be. And it gives us this information. It says the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. The equilibrium real output is 500 billion. And the full employment output is 540 billion. Let's go ahead and label that really quick. Ideally, I would do this on a separate graph, but I don't have a lot of space here. I could, okay. So it's saying this is 500, right? Our Y1, where we currently are, is 500. It's saying YF, where we should be, what our potential is 540, which means we have a gap of $40 million. Let's see if I can scroll down and start anew. Sweet. So our gap is 40 million. Let's read on. Calculate the minimum change and indicate the direction of change in government spending required to shift the aggregate demand curve by the amount of the output gap, right? Our output gap is 40 million. So in this situation, what the government wants to do, they want to spend money to increase this aggregate demand to get back to a full employment output. Now, it may seem kind of like the tempting answer. Well, all the government has to do is spend 40 million, right? We have a 40 million output gap here. Let's just spend 40 million and then problem solved. However, we have a theory called the spending multiplier. And this theory states that whenever we spend money, that money ultimately gets respent and multiplied in the economy. So for example, if you're spending $100 at a business, right, those $100, what you're really doing is you're in effect helping that business owner pay the wages of their employee. So that $100 you spent, some of that is going to the paycheck of an employee. And that employee gets their paycheck and they spend it in a different shop, right? And they fund the wages of someone else. So it's possible that, your $10 bill can be reused in a sense throughout the economy, which means that the government doesn't necessarily have to spend $40 million. They can spend less and rely on this spending multiplier to kind of fill in those gaps. It's kind of interesting, and let's take a look at this formula. The formula is going to be, what color? Let's do a good old, this one. It's going to be 1 over the marginal propensity to save, right? That's going to be the spending multiplier. Now let's talk about the marginal propensity to consume and save really quick, right? What marginal propensity means, it's your natural tendency, your natural inclination. If I were to give you $100 right now, how much of it would you spend? And if I were to give you $100 right now, how much of it would you save? Right? So that's what we talk about when we talk about marginal propensity. And it says in this problem that the marginal propensity for Canada is 0.8. This means if we were to give every Canadian $100, every Canadian would spend 80 of those dollars. Right? And so the marginal propensity, I just figured to save. It's an S. Let's just make that one big S. So Canadians, they're spending 0.8 of every dollar they earn, which has to mean, right, they're saving 0.2. And so this is always the case, right? The consumption and savings, they're always going to equal 1. And this is a very valuable piece of information, right? The marginal propensity to consume and save, because this is going to help the government decide how much they should spend, right? Because thinking about multiplying money, we want these people to spend so it can be reused and multiplied throughout the economy to get to this 40 million. So if we look at our spending multiplier equation, it is 1 over the MPS, and we know our MPS to be 2 because our MPC is 8. So let's go ahead and just plug that in right quick. We have 1 over 0.2, which equals 5. This is going to be our multiplier. So now the government knows this. It knows that the Canadian economy is going to spend 0.8 of every dollar we give them. So how much do we give them? Let's represent that as a variable, X. How much should the government spend? Well, we know our multiplier. We know we want to multiply that by 5. And we know we want this to ultimately equal that output gap of $40 million. And then this turns into a simple algebra equation, right? Divide by 5. Divide by 5. I think I'm doing this right. 40 divided by 5. That's 8, right? $8 million. And so what this means is that if the government were to spend $8 million, and this holds true that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, we will ultimately close that output gap of $40 million. That's a pretty interesting concept, and it shows like how important saving and consuming are to the economy, right? If people in Canada were saving more, this could actually be detrimental. You know, sometimes we don't want to save, sometimes we don't want to spend. And it's interesting to look into. Let's look at. Let's see if we answered this question. Calculate the minimum change. Okay, yeah. So we say if they spend 8 million, the government, we can close that output gap with that spending multiplier. Then it says part 2, it says calculate the minimum change and indicate the direction of change in taxes required to shift the aggregate demand curve by the amount of the output gap. So this has to do with taxes. Ooh, I have just enough room. So this is going to be a tax multiplier. So the government in this scenario, they're saying, no, we don't want to spend money. We're just going to cut taxes, right? We're going to decrease taxes to put more money in the pockets of our people. And so the tax multiplier, the way we figure that out is by using this equation. We have the marginal propensity to consume, And we're just going to divide that by the marginal propensity to save. This is the big one. And it gives us, right? It gives us, it's 0.8. We're going to divide that by 0.2. What's that going to give us? 4. There's our tax multiplier. And notice how the tax multiplier is a little lower than the spending multiplier. So it's kind of the same steps, right? How much should we lower taxes by? And it's also important to realize that a decrease in taxes equates to a decrease in tax revenue. So when I say how much should we decrease tax revenue by, in a sense, I'm also saying a decrease in taxes, right? This is going to be a tax revenue decrease. Because this tax revenue decrease, in a sense, this money is being given back to the people. And we're going to multiply that by our tax multiplier. And ultimately, we want that to close that $40 million gap. And this turns into a very simple problem, right? Divide by 4, divide by 4. X is going to be equal to 10 million. We want to decrease taxes in a way that we are decreasing our tax revenue by 10 million. Because if we give this 10 million back to the people, according to this tax multiplier, it's going to multiply by 4 and eventually close that output gap of $40 million. So these are the two big ones you need to know, the tax multiplier and the spending multiplier, right? 1 divided by the marginal propensity to save is going to give you the spending multiplier. And then the consumption divided by saving, that's going to give you the tax multiplier. I think there might be 2 more. There are 2 more. This is a pretty hefty problem. Now we still got D and E. It says D, assume that the Canadian government central bank takes action to restore the economy to full employment output by influencing investment spending. Draw a correctly labeled graph of the money market. All right, let's go ahead and clear this off. Let's just file, new, don't save. So we are still in a recessionary gap, and that's important to remember, right? And our ultimate goal is to increase that aggregate demand because we want to close that recessionary gap and get to that full employment output. So it's important to keep this in mind that, this is our goal. Now it says we're going to be moving to the money market. And the money market looks a little something like this. We have X and Y axis, of course. On our Y axis, we're going to have the nominal interest rate. And on the X axis, we have our real we don't have the real GDP. Whoa. We have the quantity of money. Now, let's choose some colors that actually go with this. Let's do I guess pink, sure. Our money supply is going to be represented by a straight line. Our money demanded by a slightly curved line. Here's our interest rate. Here's the quantity of money. Now, we want aggregate demand to increase, which means we want people spending. We want businesses spending. We want businesses taking out loans and spending. We want people taking out home loans and spending. All right? And loans have to do with nominal interest rate. This nominal interest rate is linked. It's chain linked to aggregate demand. And the rule of thumb is that if interest rates are increasing, aggregate demand is going to go down, right? If you see a high interest rate on a loan, you're probably going to be put off and you're saying, no, I don't want to take out this loan now. I'm going to wait until they are low so I can take out this loan. So we want our interest rate to go down. A decrease in the interest rate will let people buy more. It will let businesses invest more. So we know that. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, there's two ways to have a decrease in interest rate. Which one of these is going to happen? Are we going to have an increase in the money supply? Or are we going to have a decrease in the money demanded? Now let's go back and look for some clues. Clues. Well, first clue right here. It says, assume instead that the Canadian Central Bank takes action. Who is acting in this scenario? It is the central bank. It's not businesses who are acting. It's not consumers who are acting, right? So a very strong guess, just based off the central bank, is that they're the ones who are going to be controlling this money supply, right? So it's a very strong guess that this money supply is going to increase. But let's go on to confirm this guess. It says takes action to restore the economy to full employment output by influencing investment spending. Investment spending. Draw a correctly labeled graph of the money market. Show the accurate. Now I wonder if this means that they are, because how it works with the Federal Reserve, what they can do is they can buy securities from other banks. They can buy bonds from banks. And what I believe this problem is saying is that, or trying to say, is that if the Federal Reserve or a central bank buys something from another bank, what they are doing is they are giving this bank money. And by buying this and increasing spending, they are increasing the money supply. So I think that's what's going on in this problem. The central bank is buying up securities from other banks. They're buying bonds, and we say buying bonds equals bigger bucks. Buying bonds equals bigger bucks. Which means the money supply is increasing. With this increase in the money supply, interest rates are decreasing right there. Let's go on to see if we need to put anything else in this graph. It says draw a correctly labeled graph and show how the effect of the actions taken by the central bank. Yeah, and so that's what we show. We showed the central bank is increasing the money supply by spending. The opposite, of course, is true. You may hear the Federal Reserve is selling bonds, right? And if they are, and it's kind of hard to think about, but if they are selling bonds, that means the other smaller banks are buying them, right? The other smaller banks are giving money. The Federal Reserve is taking the money, and therefore the money supply would decrease if they were selling. Let's go on to part C. It says Canada and Mexico are trading partners. Draw a correctly labeled graph of the foreign exchange market of the Canadian dollar and show the effect of the change in interest rate in part D. So what happened to the interest rate in part D? We said that interest rates decreased. So let's keep that in mind as we move forward. Our interest rates have decreased. And let's start by talking about that for a second. If the interest rate decreases, it's easier for people to get money, and it's easier to pay off their loans. In a sense, interest rates are tied to money, which means that money itself is cheaper. Money is now cheaper. So money is cheaper. Another way of saying this, we have it's devalued, right? We have a devaluation of money. The value of our money has decreased, right? A decrease in value because of this low interest rate. Now we can apply this to our foreign exchange market graph. We have pesos, and we have Canadian dollars. We have candy, and then we have the quantity of candy. This is, of course, we have supply, we got demand, and on our y-axis we have the exchange rate, E1 and Q1. So money is now cheaper, which means the value of the Canadian dollars, right? It's important to remember that this graph is about Canadian dollars. Even though we're comparing it to pesos, what we are showing is the Canadian dollars. Our value has gone down. So if the value of Canadian dollars goes down, what's going to happen to this exchange rate? Well, let's make up a scenario. If we had one candy, that might have got us 0.8 pesos. But now that our money is cheaper, and now that it has lost value because of this lower interest rate, one Canadian dollar might only get us 0.3 pesos instead. Our exchange rate is decreasing. We're down here. E2. It's somewhere here, right? And it's kind of that same scenario that we encountered before. What's going to happen? Are we going to have that increase in supply, right? If we have an increase in supply, that can decrease the exchange rate. Or are we going to have a decrease in demand? And as I thought about this and kind of looked back for clues, I'll show you my thought process, right? So are we dealing with supply or demand? It says Canada and Mexico are trading partners. Then it says just draw the graph. So the only thing we have to go off of is this. Canada and Mexico are trading partners. And is the exchange rate going to affect supply and demand? And when I heard trading partners, my first thought was demand, right? And GDP and spending. If we have a lower exchange rate, maybe we're spending less. And so that's how I was thinking. This is going to affect demand. Demand's going to go down because we're spending less. And then I looked at the answer key, and the answer key said they were accepting both answers. They would accept an increase in supply, and they would accept a decrease in demand. I think a decrease in demand makes a little bit more sense because exchange rates have to do with trading, which have to do with demand, demanding goods. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show that decrease in demand. Which ultimately leads us to that lower exchange rate. Draw a correctly labeled graph of the foreign exchange market. Show the effect of the change in the interest rate in part D on the value of the Canadian dollar with respect to the Mexican peso. And so here it is. The exchange rate has gone down. The quantity of Canadian dollars has gone down, and that's all 5 parts. That's quite a heavy question. Looking at this question, you can kind of see how all these graphs are interconnected, right? In part A, we had that ASAD graph. Part C, what do we have? We had the fiscal policy. We had monetary policy. We had the money market graph, and we had the foreign exchange graph. So all these graphs in Unit 5, they are interconnected, and you need to know how the money market could affect the foreign exchange market. Maybe how the foreign exchange market can even affect the ASAD graph. And just a reminder, all of these graphs are on that AP College Board video guide, right? They're putting out videos every week. And I believe Unit 5 is already up. And if you want any more information about the money market or the foreign exchange market or even the ASAD graph, they will all be online on the College Board. And they are linked into this week's bulletin.